Good morning, Neo-Swedenborgians. I'm going to start today. I'm going to read about life in the spirit spheres. I'm reading from Hewat McKenzie's Spirit Intercourse, 1916 edition, page 219, under the heading The Third Sphere. He says, that natural life of the soul which man ought to inherit immediately after death, were he to live in more harmonious conditions with the law of his being while on earth, is to be found on the third sphere. One finds there a state of life far superior to that of earth, though in some respects it is singularly familiar. No one can enter this sphere who has not been purified from those weaknesses which cause so much harm and discord upon earth, and thus the companionship is of a very agreeable kind. The name Summerland is most appropriate, for the fullest sunlight shines upon the mountains, streams, valleys, and lakes of this delightful region. The light ranges from full sunlight, 100 degrees at its lowest point, to 110 degrees at its highest. Children in all stages of growth are found, especially upon the lower plane, many of these living with their own parents, while others await them, meanwhile remaining in the care of relatives, friends, nurses, and instructors. The little ones who enter the spirit realm in babyhood grow up with a beauty strangely different from that found in children who have lived some years on earth. There is a purity and sweetness in the former, sometimes lacking in the latter, but the earth child has other compensations. The homes on the third sphere are very similar in appearance to those on earth, and are scattered amongst gardens of great beauty. The tendency is to dwell together in family groups. There are no cities, for the people delight in rural surroundings and derive much benefit from this association with nature. The houses vary very little from earthly models. One would have thought that in a land where rain is never found, sloping roofs would be unnecessary, but here the great majority of the houses have such roofs, which leads one to suppose that the eye, so long accustomed to a design of this kind, looks for it as necessary to its correct appearance. Broadly speaking, the houses on this plane are constructed either in composition stone or in brick, but more generally the latter. The brickwork, being of a warm red color, gives an extremely pleasant aspect when nestled amongst green foliage, and probably for this reason is more generally adopted. Okay, so here on the third sphere, brick houses amongst green foliage. But I want to kind of lead up to that, and I'm going to read this page 158. This talks about where we are now on Earth. He says, psychic science is educating men to regard the physical world as the outhouse of existence, where the human spirit is most nearly dead, being buried within matter too crude to allow full manifestation of that spirit. Okay, so over here he says, the natural life of the soul which man ought to inherit immediately after death is the third sphere. So that's where we should be after we die if things go well, but they generally don't. And here's where we are. We are in the outhouse of existence. So the physical plane where we are now is the outhouse of existence. The third sphere is generally called Summerland. And that's beautiful beyond description. But now there's something in between the second sphere that we go to. Now these are all mapped out in this book. And curiously, there's a number of other books that have similar descriptions. One being Wanderer in the Spirit Lands by Francesco, and another being Life in the World Unseen by Monsignor Hugh Benson. Hugh Benson talks about his house, and his house in the spirit world is similar to his house in England on Earth, except it doesn't get old and it's never dusty. There's no cleaning necessary. But anyway, so we're here in the outhouse of existence. We're headed to the beautiful Summerland, but there's oftentimes a bit of a journey to get there. So the journey is through the second sphere, and I want to point out one specific thing. So I'm going to say here, so he's talking here about the second sphere of the spirit plane. Here I am on page 215. He says, on this sphere are to be found the headquarters of every religious organization known on earth, with churches and flourishing congregations served by ministers who still preach their favorite doctrine. This rather applies to the lower planes, for on the upper, practically nothing of this sort is to be found. Okay, so somebody goes to some church of some sort, and when they die and go to heaven, they go to the headquarters of that church. But it's only on the lower planes. When you get up higher, everybody's just one big family. And so he says that there's the headquarters of the different churches. But then he also has this really curious description of somebody with an extremely closed mind. And so I want to make clear that this book is not a Christian book. Hewat McKenzie, this is Hewat McKenzie, it's not a Christian book. Monsignor Hugh Benson was a priest in real life, but in the afterlife he describes something very different. And Francesco is also not a religious book. So this, as I've said before, Neo-Swedenborgianism is not a religion. It's a rational look at all this stuff. The near-death experience, the Swedenborg, and there's these writers that seem to be influenced by Swedenborg. So here we go. This is on the second realm, he says. This is page 217. A visit was paid to a large institution standing in a beautifully cultivated park surrounded with high walls. Within this lofty building, rows of small rooms were found, in each of which lived isolated patients. In one room sat an old man with an innocent and self-satisfied look upon his face, reading a religious book. His conversation to any visitor allowed to see him was somewhat as follows. Quote, "Ah, my friend, I am pleased to meet you, for the Lord has sent you my way. I see you are not one of us. You are of all men the most unfortunate, for unless you live within these sacred walls, you cannot know eternal peace. For here we live the life of the blessed, earned not by our own efforts, but through the virtues of another. I perceive you are an Englishman. Therefore, the opportunity has been yours of learning the absolute truth by which your admittance to these heavenly states would have been secured. Praise the Lord. My dear mother showed me the necessity for forming deep and impregnable convictions at an early age, and I early learned to reject the temptations that others fall into, of building their lives upon the empty conclusions of reason. But for this inflexible determination of mine to rest upon the sure and certain statements of God revealed in his word, I might have been dwelling with those unhappy souls who refuse the truth which I so earnestly on many occasions proclaimed to them. Now I have the peace and satisfaction of knowing that I was right, and they will have an eternity of time to perceive their error and to realize the folly of rejecting the gift which would have cost them nothing to accept." End quote. His keeper at this juncture entered and took him by the hand and led him out to the garden where several others wandered about, suffering from the same disease, but all equally content with their lot. This man on earth played a prominent part in religious work, leaving wherever he went disturbed minds and casting a monstrous shadow which caricatured the divine principles of life. Many schools and colleges are to be found on this plane, established for the education of the people, and from these a steady stream of enlightened souls goes forth to visit the earth in an endeavor to free the minds of men from the many superstitious ideas which there hold sway. Okay, so this rigid, he sort of sounds like it's kind of like an evangelical Christian, because he says, the truth which I so earnestly on many occasions proclaim to them. So this evangelical Christian is shown to be living in an institution behind high walls, and he has a keeper who leads him out to others suffering from the same disease. So J. Hewat McKenzie paints a very clear picture that on the second sphere, there's the headquarters of all the religious organizations from which you can graduate into the higher planes. But then there's this closed mind quality, this sort of being certain you're right kind of quality, which he's saying is puts you in basically in an institution. They're patients suffering from the same disease, and the disease seems to be a closed-mindedness. Okay, so that's it for today. 12 minutes is long enough. Map of the spirit world. Thanks. See ya.